Chapter 11, Output and Costs. This is one of the more technical chapters we do, where there's a lot of terminology and a lot of big ideas. So let's get started. Production. This chapter is about production. We've said this before, we'll say it again, we'll keep saying it. Production is about mixing the factors of production together, and in particular, labor and capital together. The optimal way to produce is that optimal mix of labor and capital. We need to keep going down the path of figuring out how we find that. Okay, so the first guy, strangely enough, to really talk about this was Adam Smith. And he talked about the pin-making industry and how the Industrial Revolution was changing making of pins. Adam Smith is writing just as we're switching to being a factory kind of economy, right? So he says, look, the old way to make pins was that one person would sit in their little shop and they would make the whole pin. They would take the wire and they would do all the little steps themselves. And if they did that, maybe they could make 4 pins in a day. If they worked on it by themselves and just sat there in their little shop and worked, they made 4 pins a day. Well, if you want to live and you make 4 pins a day, how much do you have to charge per pin to survive? $50? $100? You have to charge a lot. Those pins are going to be really expensive. There won't be a lot of them, and they'll be really expensive. But what you can do is what we call the division of labor. So you can start an assembly line. You can start a pin factory. And in the pin factory, you split up all the tasks. So instead of one craftsman doing all of this work, your job might be stretch out the wire. And that's all you do all day long is stretch out wire, stretch out wire, stretch out wire. Somebody else marks the wire where it needs to get cut, and that's all you do is you sit there and you mark and you mark and you mark and you mark and you mark. Somebody else cuts. So you can divide this making of the pin up into several dozen repeatable steps. And instead of having, 30 people sitting around in a shop and each one making a pin by themselves, instead they make them together. They work together and they have this. And what Adam Smith says is this factory maybe now can produce 40,000 pins in a day. So you have 10 workers working in this factory making 40,000 pins. They're 1,000 times more productive than doing it by themselves. That means the price of pins can go way down. Consumers will benefit. It's goodness. Okay? It's all about this production, right? How much the pins cost. The price of the pin depends on how much it costs us to make the pin, right? These things are all tied together. So I know I use, again, if you're tired of the food examples, just live with it because you're going to keep getting them. Let's think about Chipotle. If you've ever been to eat at Chipotle, they have a table when you walk in. Right? And on their side of the table, they have tortillas of different kinds, and beans of different kinds, and rice, and veggies, and meats of different kinds, and then lettuce, and guacamole, and cheese, and 5 different kinds of sauce you can put on it, and all these things you can put on your burrito. And so you start at one end, you get your big tortilla, somebody heats it up, and then you slide down, and they keep saying, do you want this or this or this? And you tell them what you want, and they put it on, and then you get to the end, and it's all wrapped up, and you pay them. Okay? So somebody has to cook all this stuff, and you can see in the back here the cooking materials. And then you've got 3 or 4 different tasks that have to get performed on the line. And actually, you could split the tasks up with the cooking. And very often you see that when you go in the Chipotle. If one person is trying to do this all, that person's not going to be very effective. They're going to have to cook everything. They're going to have to make everything. They're going to have to check you out. They're going to have to keep too much. When I add a second person, that's having 2 people. They probably actually get more work done than twice what the one person could do by themselves. Because now they can help each other. They can, one can cook and one can do, or one can work this end of the line and one can work that end of the line. If you add a third person again, it's very helpful. 4 and 5 people. As you get into that restaurant, you have people cooking all the time. You have a line that's moving because each station on the line can have a different person working at it. It's very productive. What happens when you get the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th? Pretty soon you start adding people that don't have anything to do. And maybe you start adding people that are literally getting in the way of people who do have work to do. So as we add workers, the productivity of those workers is high up to some point, and then after that point, the productivity of adding more workers starts going down. Well, that means there's a best point, right? There's a right number of workers when they're really busy, when that line is as long as it can be in that restaurant. There's an optimal number of people to get the folks who come in to buy burritos and tacos through that line. Okay? All right, so let's do some simple, stupid math. We have some terminology. Total product is the output that we're producing. So maybe it's how many burritos we make per hour that we work. Okay? The marginal product is the additional production we get from adding 1 unit of labor. So as I go from, say, 1 worker to 2 workers, the additional production I get from that second worker is that worker's marginal product. All right? So we start out here at our restaurant. We have no workers. Well, how much do we produce if we have no workers? Hopefully you all believe that we produce nothing if we have no workers, and so our total product is 0. Now we have 1 worker come in. That worker by themselves can make 5 burritos an hour. They have to cook. They have to do all the serving stuff, 5 an hour. That's all they can get done. The marginal product of that worker is 5 burritos. Okay? Their marginal product is 5 burritos. Now, if you think this through, and we'll talk about this again in a second, if a burrito is $7, that means that worker is generating how much money? Well, they're generating $35 in that hour. They're producing 5 burritos times $7. They're creating $35. Now, you're saying, well, they're not going to get paid $35. And yeah, they shouldn't, because there's capital in that deal. There's land in the form of beans and guacamole and tortillas. And there's the people who own the restaurant. There's all these other costs. But without that worker, they would not have generated that $35. Okay? That worker is not solely responsible. You can also argue that without the building, they wouldn't have generated the $35. But just trying to get some ideas here now. So now I hire worker number 2. With worker number 2, I can produce 12 burritos. So now I've got 2 people working. I'm making 12 burritos an hour. The marginal product of that worker is 7. Yes? 7. Difference between 12 and 5 is 7. All right? I hire a third worker. In comes the third worker. Now I have 3 people working. Maybe I have 1 person cooking and 2 people working the line. Now I can produce 30 burritos in an hour. What did that third worker give me? Well, that third worker gave me 18 burritos, the difference between 30 and 12. So the marginal product of the third worker is 18 burritos per hour. At a fourth worker, now I go to 72 burritos. That line's cruising, and that worker produced 42. Now again, they didn't do it by themselves, but the additional output that we got by hiring them was 42 burritos. Okay? And the fifth worker, our total product goes up to 100 burritos. That means that worker contributed 28. The difference between 72 and 100. And get ready with me here. We could also figure out the average. I didn't put this on here, but if one worker makes 5, that's 5 per worker. If 2 workers makes 12, that's 6 per worker. If 3 workers makes 30, that's 10 per worker. If 4 workers make 72, that's 18 per worker. If 5 workers make 100, that's 20 per worker. Okay, so we have the total product, the marginal product. We could also calculate the average product. The sixth worker, we only get 110 burritos when we hire that sixth worker total, which means that sixth worker was only worth 10 more. So we were going up as we added workers, but at some point adding workers isn't that helpful anymore, and the value of adding more workers goes down. So if we're busy, it certainly appears that 5 workers is good. Hiring that sixth worker might not be worth it. Okay? What if the 20th worker, well, that 20th worker, our total product is only 10, and the marginal product of that 20 worker is negative. They're dragging us down. They're getting in the way. They're actually preventing us from being able to sell. Okay? All right. A definition. When the quantity of a unit of an input is fixed. Now think about this. The Chipotle or the restaurant, whatever restaurant you want to imagine, when you go in that restaurant, there are things about that restaurant that are fixed. The size of the restaurant is fixed. If the line's really long, they don't throw up a tent to add more tables. They've got a certain number of tables. The serving area is a certain size. The kitchen is a certain size. There are things in what they do that are fixed. Okay? On the other hand, there are things that are variable. So the number of workers who are working today is variable. That means that, if we had 5 people in and it's really slow, the boss will turn to one of them and say, hey, you want to go home early? And they'll go, yeah, and off they go. Okay, now we only have 4 workers. Okay? We can't send part of the building home if we don't need it, but we can send some of the workers home if we don't need them. Okay? When the building size is fixed, there's no value at some point in adding more workers. We add the right number of workers for the size of the building we got and the space we've got, and it doesn't help us to add more workers after a point. So we get what's called diminishing Margery returns or diminishing marginal productivity. At some point, we keep adding more workers, and the additional value of adding those workers starts to go down. This happens when some of the inputs are fixed and some of the inputs are variable. Adding more of these things we can vary. Eventually, we reach a point where there's no value in adding them. We can vary the amount of chicken we have, but at some point, there's no reason to add more chicken than we've already got. We've got all the chicken we needed. All right, if we graph this, it looks like this. At the bottom, it's between A and B, it's increasing as it goes up. That's when we first started out, and we added a couple workers, and we were getting a lot of value. But then the curve changes, and it's going up from B to C to D to E to F. Each time it's going up less. We're having diminishing returns, diminishing marginal productivity, diminishing marginal return to hiring more workers. Everybody see that? B to C is bigger than C to D, which is bigger than D to E, which is bigger than E to F. Each worker we hire is giving us less of an increase. They're giving us more, but they're giving us less more.